Okay, let's start now. So we can. You will sit there. Or no. You will sit. Find a chair. Take a chair. We will discuss this book, Political Orthodoxies, the unorthodoxies of the church squares. It's very provocative book. So if you have read it, you realize why I say it's very provocative, because it criticizes almost everything that exists. And that's it creates huge discussion about this book, because if Cyril Hovorun is correct in his views, we have a major problem, a real problem in Eastern Christianity, because more or less the book advocates the idea that these political orthodoxies are present everywhere in each layer of the church and pose a threat to the Church of Christ. And from my perspective, what he's talking about is more or less most of the discussions I encounter among laity in the Orthodox and Eastern Christian world is about these issues. So it's the most provocative book, and it needs a provocative answer. And therefore, we have suggested to give the floor later on here, not just now, because then there will be a huge discussion here, by Davor Dzalto, who will make a provocative answer to this book. So we will have quite a tough discussion, I think, between the parties. So, I will not, and this is intentionally, I realized when I read the book that these two persons will be the real components of discussion here. So I will moderate this discussion, but I will give the author the first word and the last word. So he will introduce his book, and in the end he will give the final saying. So you will not have a final saying this time, it will come next time.
That's perfectly fine.
And in between this first and final saying, Davor will be the one, I know he has a lot to say, so first of all, I give the floor to Cyril. Maybe you sit down.
Oh, maybe I can do it from here.
Yeah. Would you like to have a better chair?
No, this one.
Then I sit here.
You sit there.
Yeah.
I want to be far enough from Davor.
Yeah.
Just like the boxing ring. And you will be our referee.
Yeah. Don't be afraid.
Right. Well, actually, this book came as a result of an assignment. I was approached by the publisher, by Fortress Press, which published it, and they wanted something on nationalism in the Orthodox world. They just started a series which is called Dispatches. I think it continues an older series that was published several decades ago, and its purpose was to address the contemporary issues in different Christian traditions. They wanted to actually they watched this series, and they approached different people in different traditions, Christian traditions, mostly in the United States, to address the issues which are pertinent to different traditions, contemporary issues, including including nationalism, which is perceived to be the main problem for the Orthodox Church. And this is true. I initially hesitated, to be honest, to respond because I had my own projects, and it was just a kind of intervention to my schedule. But then I thought, well, it's an opportunity to address a broader array of issues which exist in the Eastern Christian view. Nationalism is certainly one of them, but there are so much more things on our plate that we could discuss in addition to nationalism. And actually, when I began thinking about this, I got lost because it had to include the historical part, and I began thinking about different ways of doing political orthodoxy. I was read the origin of the title. In the past, I realized that we can actually see many things that happened in our past as instances of political orthodoxy. I suddenly realized that, well, Arianism was an instance of political orthodoxy. You could address it like that. It was a politicized theological doctrine which had very strong political charge. And then you could consider the entire controversy about Chalcedon. We just had a session on Chalcedon, and we discussed the political implications of the Council of Chalcedon, the division that it caused. And as a matter of fact, if you start thinking about the Council of Chalcedon, the great first great schism, then you realize that there was a lot of politics there, a lot of political influence there. Then you go to the great schism between the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic Church, the same political framework, and of course our modern time. I began thinking about this. I realized that I would produce several volumes. The problem with this publisher was that they put restriction of 40,000 words. So it was impossible to, just completely impossible to develop it further, and they were very strict on that. So I decided to take only 3 cases to study in modernity, the case of the Greek Church, the Romanian Church, and the Russian Church. I made some brief introduction, brief survey of the historical instances in the past of political orthodoxy, and then studied those 3 cases and 3 particular incarnations of political orthodoxy, several incarnations like nationalism, anti-Semitism, which I think was which is an important, almost untouched issue in the Orthodox discussions, theological discussions, the Orthodox, particularly Orthodox anti-Semitism. And I came actually to some interesting conclusions. I'm really proud of this conclusion. I believe that I came to a conclusion that anti-Semitism is a Christological heresy, a very fundamental Christological heresy. I will not discuss it right now. We'll say something. And also ideological biases within our churches, like conservatism, like monarchism, and so forth. So I studied several problems in 3 cases, in the case of the churches, and that's how political orthodoxy was born. A few last words about the title. Actually, the term per se political orthodoxy was coined in the discussions that emerged in the Russian Church. I believe one of the authors that comes to my mind, who actually wrote the book, is the notorious, famous Cyril Hovorun. He's a crazy Russian publicist who publishes a lot on modern issues, and I believe he's one of the persons who produces, generates all sorts of political orthodoxy. And he was a proponent of political orthodoxy. He believed that political orthodoxy is something very good, very important for the church to develop, to grow in the Orthodox education. And I disagreed with him, and I thought that political orthodoxy is the wrong thing. And actually, we even postulated this in a decision, in a considered decision. In 2007, we faced in Ukraine, I was in Ukraine at the time, and we faced the problem of different groups of laity who protested against political developments in Ukraine. They protested against the Western influence upon Ukraine. They protested against NATO, against the Western countries, against the US, and so forth. So they had traditional ecclesial processions with icons and the slogans against some political issues. And this was a big problem for the church because they affiliated themselves with the Orthodox Church at the time, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, under the Moscow Patriarchate, and we decided to do something with that. We gathered the council, it was a council of bishops in December 2007. And at the council we discussed this issue. And we decided to articulate this issue as a political orthodoxy. Actually, I should say that I drafted the decision of the council. And I inserted this term, political orthodoxy, which was condemned by the bishops of the church. And I believe it is the only ecclesial condemnation, conciliar condemnation of this phenomenon, political orthodoxy, in the modern church kind of milieu. And then I began promoting this title. We said, yeah, this concept of political orthodoxy as a wrong perception of orthodoxy and of theology. And we had also a conference in Helsinki, right, 3 or so years ago, in the center of St. Sophia, organized by the Church of Finland, where we discussed the issue of political orthodoxy for the first time on the unorthodox scale. And then this book came, where I also tried to explain myself the decisions of the Council of the Bishops on Ukraine in 2007, what we had the discussion that we had in Helsinki. So it's a second stage in the evolution, long evolution of the discussions about political orthodoxy. I hope it is not the last stage. It will continue. There will be more discussions, I hope, on the issues, not necessarily, but on the issues, and that's how I would like to explain the background and the history as well.
Thank you, Father. So, Political Orthodoxies, the unorthodoxies of the Church coerced, written by Cyril Hovorun, who has been the head of the Department of External Affairs in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate before, and has been studying in Greece and in Britain, and has been doing research in the United States at Yale University, and now he is the director of a Huffington Ecumenical Institute in Los Angeles, Loyola Marymount University, and also a teacher in Sankt Ignatios Theological Academy, which we hope will be more. And then we have on the left side Davor Dzalto, professor in religion, art and peace, right? In the American University of Rome. And why he is sitting here on my left side is they share the same field in many ways, but from different angles, I would say. From a lay side, from the power side. And this will create a kind of laity clergy dialogue, because Father Cyril has been so immensely drenched in the structures of power, both in Moscow Patriarchate and on the international Orthodox level. He's been sitting in, I think, all dialogues except the Lutherans.
No.
Lutherans also, including Lutherans. So he's been in all dialogues between Orthodoxy and non-Orthodox churches. That's impressive. And also been sitting in the power center of power in the Orthodox Church. And now he is here with us. But now I will give the word to Davor, because you have a lot to say. So begin, and then we will have Cyril responding, and then I will invite you also to have comments along the way.
So thank you, Michael, for inviting me. Thank you all for being here. All that introduction, the dramatic beginning that we went through was actually there just to attract your attention, because in actual reality, most of the time, Father Cyril and I agree in well, most of the points, and I actually, not all, we might even tackle. And well, I think the primary disagreement, as far as I see it, has to do with the geopolitics, not really Orthodox theology or Orthodox ecclesiology. So most of these things that are discussed here, actually, and the points that Father Cyril raised, I think are raised not only correctly, but are very much needed nowadays, and we should reflect upon them. Incidentally, in most of my writings dealing with the issues of political theology, I've been pretty much raising the same kind of issues: the problem of nationalism, the problem of imperialism, the ethnocentricity in many local Orthodox contexts, and so on and so forth. Of course, sometimes I stress more the issue of the power structures, because I think that very often is the crucial thing to think about and keep in mind as we also think of theological concepts and various interpretations of them. So I want to talk more about the book itself, because I hope you'll all read it, and Father Cyril actually explain its structure and the purpose of the book. In a certain sense, I see its value in the fact that, in a way, it is syllabus errorum of in contemporary detecting in the contemporary Orthodox world major issues when it comes to how theology is used or interpreted for the purposes of developing particular ideologies. So you'll find there a very concise review of all those positions, focusing on those three regions in particular, Greece, Romania, and Russia, but of course most of these observations generalize. So I'll go straight to some of the questions that I had for Father Cyril as I was reading this book, and I actually will use this opportunity to ask for clarifications and more comments. So it's not so much a matter of any critical remarks as it is an attempt to understand some of the observations better. So at the very beginning, you start with this distinction. You try to differentiate what you call political orthodoxy, and I suppose something that is true orthodoxy, contrasted to that. You define political orthodoxy as something being distinct from original Christian orthodoxy, insofar as political orthodoxy is defined in negative terms as something that pretty much, if I may paraphrase, misuse or misappropriation of certain theological concepts for the purposes of various types of coercion within particular societies. And you also list those, you also make a distinction between theology proper and ideology. Theology being something, to quote from the book, the difference between the two is that for theology the unseen is uncreated God, while for ideology the unseen is the world of ideas confined to the human mind. The former drives masses to God in eternity, and the latter to contemporary political and social gods. Now, my question in regard to that, and you also list various examples from the past, such as Arianism or monothelitism, in order to illustrate how theological concepts can be used to actually make sense of certain political reality. So I would like to turn the tables around and ask a simple question. Well, why not interpret in the same way Chalcedonian dogma and Chalcedonian Christianity? Because arguably you can also say if we see in Arianism a theological attempt to conceptualize a unified empire and unified power of the Roman Emperor, and in monothelitism an idea that actually these, as you illustrate, church and state and their ways of working in the world are meant to be united and actually be expressed only through one. One will arguably that of the state. Why not then reading also Chalcedonian understanding of the two natures issues as another conceptualization of one variation of the symphony? So in other words, saying, okay, we are not coming together. There is no way that church will be completely subordinate to the state, but actually will have two of them and will express that as a harmonious existence within one whole, one person Christ. So in other words, why is this theological methodology reserved, that you're implementing, reserved just for the heresies and not for what we consider orthodoxy? And you know, why don't take it a step further and be consequential there? In that regard, also the issue of the distinction between theology and ideology provokes, it seems to me, a question whether we want to define, and it seems to me that we need to be clear there, do we want to approach the world of ideas from a theological perspective, or are we approaching the world of ideas from an ideological or secular perspective? Because when you make this distinction that I just quoted, that theology has to do with the unseen and ideology with the world of ideas confined to the human mind, well, some might object to that, that theology also uses concepts that are human concepts and come from human mind. So, and if you take a secular position, it becomes very difficult to see how is theology not an ideology. So in other words, it seems to me that there is no neutral way of approaching these things. Either we take a theological perspective a priori. In that context, then we just deal with various kinds of good or bad theologies. Or we take a secular perspective, and in that case, theology becomes also just a specific case of ideology, which is used, as you show, in many examples in various circumstances, and some of those effects can be actually quite disastrous. So this is actually something that has to do with just conceptual realm and the way how we can define these things. So I would very much like to hear a follow-up on that. Okay,
let's take this Macedonian issue first, because I think this is important.
Yes, that is the basic question. That's the basic issue. Actually, I faced the difficulty of distinguishing between ideology and theology, and I thought a lot about how to differentiate them. And eventually, I decided that probably the goal would be the differentiating point, because in methods they coincide very often. They use the same. Sometimes they use the same concepts. In the effect upon masses, they function the same way. They subscribe millions of people for the same cause, both theology and ideology. They can be articulated by the same institutions. The church can be articulating both theology and ideology. So what is then the difference? The origins can be the same, the process can be the same, methods can be the same for theology and ideology. The only difference, I believe, between them is the goal, the final destination, where they arrive. And,
but from a theological perspective.
Yes. Well, I write from the theological perspective. I cannot write from...
because you said at the beginning it's also sociology.
Yes, I try to create an impression that it is multi-disciplinary, the book. And yes, and I use some sociological categories to explain the theological phenomena and sociological phenomena. But what I want to say that theology and ideology are hardly distinguishable. That is true. Probably they are inseparable, and this is just an illusion, a nice, wish to have them separated from one another. And this entire project is completely utopistic. It's not realistic. It's about something that cannot happen. That ideology and theology can be, in our situation, can be separated eventually. If you want, this is utopia. This is an idealistic approach. In this regard, maybe I'm more idealist than you are. Which surprises me. And the only thing that can distinguish them and differentiate them is the goal that they want to achieve. Because the goal of every single ideology, even if ideology is theological, is confined to this world. If you take, for instance, the church nationalism, because the churches now profess nationalism more than they profess, Trinity and Christ and everything else, the purpose of nationalism is confined to this world, to make people happy, to make folks enjoying their identity, ethnic identity, to keep them together. The church also supports the issue of nationalism, to bring them back to the church. That is also the purpose of the nationalism professed by the churches. But in all the cases, the purpose is about this world. Theology is transcendental. It's about the interests of the people that would go beyond this world. That would be my answer to this question. And the first question, I will be very brief. Speaking about the Chalcedonian model, well, I need to explain very briefly. The idea is that Arianism is corresponding to the imperial model of governance in the state and in the church, because the Trinitarian model professed by Arius suggests that a very strict hierarchy between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And this suited very well the the imperial church and the imperial state at the time, which is a thesis which I did not invent. It was invented by Eric Peterson in the 30s in his dialogue, in his dispute with Kalshin. I extrapolated further this idea, and I suggested, for instance, other Christological models served other political developments at the time. The monophysitic, again, I want to stress, I don't confuse monophysitic with the non-Chalcedonian model, which is completely different. The monophysitic Eutychian, original Eutychian model, presupposes essentially the state which consumes, which absorbs the church, and which makes the church a complete part of the state mechanism. And monothelitism is probably the most advanced model, which suggests that the will of the emperor should prevail over the two natures of the state, which is the church and the state. Whereas criticism of Chalcedonianism. Well, from this perspective, I should admit it, the ideal model would be Nestorian. From the perspective of modern time, of the separation between the church and the state. The Nestorian model, I didn't want to, to be apologetical about Nestorianism, but it comes naturally. And if we see historically how it developed, Nestorianism at the Church of the East, the Nestorian Church originally, was the most successful in its mission and its spread at the time in the late antiquity, because it reached as far as China, something that neither Byzantines nor non-Chalcedonians could manage. So it's a disputable, it's a good question. I have to confess then in heresy if I answer honestly to your question, and I did a bit in answering that. Thank you, Mark.
Okay. But before you continue, there's one question. Maybe I take it away from you, but I have to place the question anyway. And that is, if you say that ideology is related to this world, theology related to, but isn't an incarnated church in need of both ideology and theology?
It is probably so. It's a good question, yes. Certainly that's why the churches embark on ideology eventually, because they feel that, yes, they need to address the modern issues pertinent to the life of the people in this world. And they do it in different ways. In the West, they do it by employing, different liberal ideologies. In the East, it's mostly the churches take on board mostly conservative ideologies, but all the ideologies that they address the problems pertinent to the life of the people. I think probably the problem is when the churches have only ideologies, no theology. When even theology is recruited to pursue the goals of this life, of this world. And the other thing is about naming things by their proper names. The problem is when what we believe to be theology is substituted by ideology, and the churches or the people, Christians or leaders, call ideology, they call it theology, and they pretend that by doing political things, they effectively do theological things. In other words, they do political things, but they call it theology. They call it religious things, and this creates this confusion when people believe that whatever they do for this life is sacred. They believe that what the government does, what the society does in the big world, in the secular world, in the church, they know that they do secular things. They know that it is about this life. It is about the well-being of the people. That's why they realize that it is temporarily, it is conditional, it is relative. But when the church does the same humanly, social, political things with the idea that it is divine, what is doing it is divine, immediately everything which is temporarily, which is in this life, becomes sacred. And then you can easily abuse things. Say, it is good to have national identity, to cherish national identity, to build a nation. It's excellent. Why not? It helps people, to be consolidated, to feel proximity to another guy. But when the church postulates this, makes this statement, it turns into a sacred institution. Then easily all kinds of shortcomings, which are pertinent to any human institution, becomes immediately sacred, and as a result, they become abused, they become corrupted. Then you can have a situation when corruption itself becomes sacred. Then we can have a situation which I sometimes call, sacred prostitution, when prostitution happens in a temple, as it used to be, in antiquity, it becomes sacred. It becomes almost, divine, while it remains prostitution. In the church, corruption then may become sacred, a sacred institution, and it is not dealt with, it is not addressed, because it is perceived as a divine institution. Because against those two planes, the sacred, the metaphysical, and the immanent, they are confused. So it's okay that the churches care about the needs of the people in this life. It's okay, but let us call them needs of this life. Let us call them temporarily, conditional, changeable. Let us criticize them just because they are, pertinent to this life, but not we should not sacralize them. We should not make them sacred, and thus we should not introduce this, sacred prostitution in the church.
So, after this sacred prostitution, you can continue.
Yeah, but just as a footnote to that, like sacred prostitution actually, for whatever we know, wasn't prostitution at all. So it was just in those temples a way to reunite with God without paying directly for that, which again, Christian history actually very much misrepresented what was ancient religion. But it has to do with the point is there. Because I just wanted to follow up on what has just been said. Because in a certain sense, it seems to me that what you're saying is more or less this. So theology, properly speaking, is not political in a certain sense. Or should not be. Okay. So every time we enter the realm of politics, we are actually in the realm of ideologies, and therefore it becomes political orthodoxy as a bad concept, which has to do with more or less higher or lower levels of coercion and exercise of power and all of that. So what proceeds from that is that, logically, that every manifestation of orthodoxy in the social political realm is by definition one of those errors that you listed in your book. So either nationalism or this and that. So the question then becomes, well, does that mean by implication that authentic orthodoxy is some kind of Neoplatonic spirituality that needs to remain disembodied from its presence in this world? So maybe it's not even so much an Nestorian solution as much as Neoplatonic one.
You just hit the nerve of at least my thought. Well, orthodoxy as we know it now in its pure form, if it does exist, it is Neoplatonic, certainly. I think even the idea of orthodoxy is somehow Neoplatonic to some extent. And certainly, what happened to Neoplatonism? It distanced itself completely from any politics. They detested politics. They really disgusted it. They didn't want to be mixed up with politics. And they ended up very much engaged in politics. That what happened to this phenomenon. And this is exactly what happened to the church, even to the Orthodox. Of course, yes, the Christianity began as a countercultural, as anti-political, and non-political phenomenon movement, and then detested engagement with politics, and ended up in the symphony, which is essentially which was in effect confusion, complete confusion in the Eutychian sense, or between the politics and religion in the empire. And it seems that, as I said, realistically speaking, the church will always probably be engaged in this realm. Nowadays, in the modern time, ideology plays the role of the empire in late antiquity and in the Middle Ages. At that time, there were no ideologies. There were states, the empires, right? The empire, the Roman Empire, the old empire that exists, and then the replications of those empires later on. And the churches the church, after it engaged with the Roman Empire, since then has become engaged to the realm of politics, of religion. I believe that anti-Chalcedonian movement, to some extent, the movement against the Chalcedon, was also an attempt to escape the empire, to escape this confusion, mixture with the empire. And eventually what happened to even to this anti-Chalcedonian movement, it became engaged to other sorts of politics, with the Arabic Caliphate, for instance, at some stage, with other political entities, and I believe that it was kind of inevitable. In the modernity, when the empires collapsed, or they were close to collapse, and the national states, as you mentioned, and sometimes the church found itself outside of the very firm political framework. The ideologies that placed the empire as the main political framework for the church. In other words, the ideologies became the new empire for the church. Sometimes the churches who wanted to escape the empire got engaged to ideologies. In other words, it's like inevitable. It's like almost, you know, condemnation for Christianity to be a part of the political life. Therefore, is it possible at all that the church can live and function outside of the political realm? I think it is unrealistic. Again, I should admit the church will always produce political orthodoxies. This will always happen. The purpose of my book was not to describe a situation where the church would be liberated from political orthodoxy. My purpose was to say that there is political orthodoxy and there is orthodoxy proper. There is church proper. We cannot separate them, but we need at least to distinguish between them. We need to avoid the confusion between two things. When we call normative Christianity, or when we call what is indeed, in fact, political orthodoxy, we call it Christianity. We call it normative Christianity. How it should be. No, it's not how it should be. It's how it is. But always there should be a momentum for the church to try to overcome this this confinement to the political frames.
To be apolitical in a certain sense.
Political, yeah.
Okay. Just related to that, it seems that you are proposing some kind of alternative to all the critical remarks that I think are fully justifiable when it comes to nationalism, imperialism, and stuff like that. And you say there is a healthier alternative to both civilizational and ethnic nationalisms. It consolidates people not around common identities, but around common civil values, such as solidarity and justice. Nationalism makes people feel superior to other people. In contrast to this, the awareness that citizens in a civil society share urges them to treat others as their neighbors, regardless of who and what they are. In this sense, unity of people based on civil values that apply to all humankind is closer to the gospel than the unity built on national or civilizational identities. So it seems that this would be a way to put in practice this apolitical orthodoxy, to still be political, but not in a nationalistic or ethnocentric way. But my question is, where do you see this ideal or model put in practice? And that is related to something else that I wanted to ask you to comment on and expand. It seems as we go through the various case studies that you are constructing this narrative about all the political expressions of orthodoxy ending up in this kind or that kind of ideologies that are oppressive in various ways, but that you, in a subtle way, without explicitly mentioning that, contrast the Western kind of modern secular society to this as an alternative.
Right. Yes.
just as a footnote to that, but and then you criticize, for example, those monarchist ideas and modern nationalisms in local Orthodox context. But it seems to me that what needs to go together with that is a simple acknowledgement that in many of these cases in local Orthodox context, those nationalistic ideas that were linked with Christian identities were actually imported from the West. They were Protestant, and not only Protestant, but primarily Protestant models. So in other words, that a lot of that goes into the story about 19th century, for example, Russian context, was actually an attempt to build modern society, which will be, in a way, less Orthodox, of course, officially Orthodox, but actually more secular Protestant-like than traditional Orthodox. So that would be my question. Do you see what we usually call as a modern secular society, and we all know problems with that concept and how actually it turns out not to be secular at all, but just coming from different religious dimensions, perspectives, as a variation to that. It seems also that you are proposing a kind of healthy patriotism as a solution to nationalism, and I'm kind of instinctively skeptical when it comes to any kind of good patriotisms. So what would that actually entail, and how can we make sure that this healthy patriotism won't turn into bad nationalism that you rightly criticize?
Well, that is the thing with political orthodoxies, that they begin very, very well as healthy phenomena, and then they easily turn to unhealthy phenomena. That was the idea of the fate of nationalism. Nationalism began, I believe, as a very good thing for the church. Actually, nationalism initially was introduced to the church as an instrument of liberation of the church from the strong hierarchical models. Imagine, in the Middle Ages, they had this idea of bishops being at the top of the church hierarchy and the lay people on the bottom of this hierarchy. And there was no actually any bridge between them. Then the first bridge, which was introduced by modernity to this strict hierarchical structures, was nationalism, the idea of nation. That patriarch, who is on the top of the hierarchy, of the pyramid, and me, the last lay person who attends the church, we belong to the same thing. We belong to the nation. It was a huge liberating idea, which created a huge momentum for the churches, to reconsolidate themselves, to become one thing again. It was very important. And therefore I believe that was the good thing about nationalism originally. But soon, nationalism turned to a bad thing when we, as the people of the same nation, now, yes, of course, we are bishops, patriarchs, priests, and lay people, we belong to the same nation, but there is another nation, and other bishops, priests, and lay people belong to another nation, and we feel that they are different, they are them, and we are us. And now we begin struggling, not within the strata, between the strata in the church, but we begin struggling and fighting each other on the horizontal level. It is good to replace vertical communications and structures with horizontal ones. But then what may follow, is the struggle between on the level of the horizontal structures. That's how the nationalistic wars began. It is easily traceable in the case of the Balkan nations, where they first liberated themselves from the empires, from the Ottoman and Habsburg empires, and it was very, very positive and very good thing. And soon they began fighting one another, the national state. That's how the Balkan Wars were waged in the beginning of the 20th century. So it applies to all sorts of political orthodoxies. That they can be interpreted at the first stage as something positive, but then they easily turn to something really bad. And speaking about the first remarks that you had about secularism and ideology and stuff. I believe that in secular society and an alternative to civil society as an alternative to a nation, I've been accused of replacing the old forms of political orthodoxy with a new form of political orthodoxy. there's some people who criticize me. They say, well, you criticize political orthodoxy, but instead you suggest another kind of political orthodoxy, which is probably true. I would not maybe say that it's not true. And I need to work on this, certainly. But in this case, what I would suggest is that, yes, there are some old forms of political orthodoxy which have become toxic for the church. Nationalism, which began I believe as a positive thing in the church, gradually turned to a toxic thing for the church, as it became toxic for the nations and for the people. In the same sense, many other structures in the church, which we could identify as political orthodoxies, have become toxic. Therefore, they should be replaced by new forms. They could be, forms of theology, very idealistic, early Christian, patristic stuff, which we could suggest instead of political orthodoxies. Or they could be replaced by renewed, updated forms of political orthodoxy. And apparently, when the church allies itself with the civil society instead of relying with the nation, with the state, those are outdated forms of political orthodoxy. And the church aligning itself with the civil society is a more modern form of political orthodoxy. This is just an update to political orthodoxies. It's not a quantum leap to something else beyond political orthodoxy. But still, it is better than to stay with the old toxic forms.
I think we open up for everyone to. Sure. So I open up for everyone to have questions for either Foisy or if you have a question to Davor also, of course. Yes.
Stephen Brown from Ecumenical Review at the World Council of Churches. I have one very straightforward question, which is why did you choose those three particular case studies? And what do you see as the main distinguishing features between them as to why they should be treated as three case studies?
Yeah. Well, I had this difficulty. I know that I'm pretty much hated by many in the Orthodox Church. I wanted to choose the churches where I'm already hated. I didn't want to produce new enemies, and to criticize the churches which still don't know my work and would not care about my work. And of course, another thing is that I knew some churches. I know some churches better than others. I certainly know the Russian church. I still belong to the Russian church, to the Moscow Patriarchate, and I lived there for many years. And I was an insider in the developments and many things that I've written in this book. They don't exist in sources. I just took them from the first hand. Then I lived for a long while in Greece. I love the Greek church. I love the Greek Orthodoxy, and as much as I love it, I'm able to also criticize it. And I took the Romanian church not because I know it better than other churches, and not because its language is more accessible for me than other churches. I would probably have taken the Serbian church. If I had a second chance to write this book, I should probably take the Serbian church instead of the Romanian church. But the Serbian church represents a culture, tradition within the Orthodoxy, which is self-sufficient to a great extent. We are nowadays talking about the local churches in the world, which are, 15. I include the Ukrainian church as the 15th. Some of this. But they also speak about three major currents, traditions within Orthodoxy, which is one is Russian, another one is Greek, and the third one is the kind of alternative to both of them is the Romanian, which is self-sufficient, which does not align itself with any tradition, with any church, and it's really huge. It's big. It's one of the largest churches. So essentially, those three cases represent three major unseen, maybe uninstitutionalized traditions within the modern Orthodoxy, and the strife that we observe nowadays within the church, all those creeds and schemes, whatever we call them, they engage those three streams. So I believe it was not clear when I was writing this book yet about what would happen, in the relation between Moscow and Constantinople, what place would be taken by the Romanian Church. But now, as the things develop, it is quite clear that main players in the new situation with the inter-Orthodox relations will be the Russian Church, the Greek Church, like the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and the Romanian Church.
Yes, I'm Father Sergio Mainoldi. I'm a scholar and Orthodox priest in the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So thank you, Father Cyril. It is always stimulating. So as I did in the book, and I will do, and as I can understand that you took as a model the situation where Orthodoxy is the majority in the state. So you took a model of state against the Church, the challenge relationship also historically, Roman state and so on. So, but what about the situation that is growing since many years in the diaspora, where there are minoritarian churches, but now, as example in Europe, Orthodoxy is the second confession in many states, Austria, Italy, and France, and so on. So, as it seemed to me that something that is not proposing the model of state-church relationship, but something other. For example, in the current situation in the Russian exarchate, there is a new model of political orthodoxy is growing up, dealing with representative power in the church, trying to be free from state-church relationships, but at the same time to pretending to have an independence from all of the other churches, sort of a congregant nationalism in Orthodoxy that has a strong political level, and I think is very dangerous, as well as the toxic relationship between state and the church.
Yes, well, that's a good question. Actually, yes, I avoided because I was limited really by the publisher for how much I can write, how many words I can do. I was really limited by that. But in other books of mine, like the Scaffolds of the Church, where I analyze the structures of the Church, I always have attention to the situation in the diaspora, outside the traditional churches. And I suggested, for instance, in the book, that the model of the local church should not be always observed, especially outside the traditional practice in the diaspora. We just had a discussion in our session about the idea of the local church, about the idea of the one bishop, one bishop. I argue that this is a Roman idea. That the Church adopted at some stage the philosophy of territory as it was elaborated in the Roman Empire, and it was not apostolic philosophy, it was not Christian philosophy in its beginning. Of course, it fitted well the interest of the Church used it as a helpful instrument, but again, what happened, that we have identified, almost identified, this philosophy of territory, which stems from the Roman political ideology, political philosophy, with the Church per se. And we have secularized, if you want, this concept of one bishop. We struggle, we fight each other, we kill each other just for the sake, of this principle, which is not Christian. Yes, it is helpful. It used to be, it goes to be good, but not more than that. We produce, perceive this principle of territoriality almost like second constitution, whatever it means. In the ancient church, and it applies directly to the situation in Israel. Therefore, I personally believe there's nothing wrong about having several bishops in one city. I believe this is completely justifiable. It corresponds to the situation in the early Christians studied that situation, and as far as it fits, the needs of the communities in diaspora, it's okay. No problem with that.
Yes. Actually, we live in such a situation, and we are not, we can do our liturgies without, there is a bishop in Manchester, another bishop also. It's a big problem, but actually the practical problems are arising when community are not just of 10 people, but 100 million. So in Italy, the problem is rising very seriously. And maybe, yes, in a very minoritarian situation, your idea that coexistence of several bishops in the same city can be, but when you have a relationship with the state, now in Italy, for example, the Greek archdiocese has a intesa, an agreement with the state. So this agreement was delayed 4 years because there is a principle of anti-constitutionalism against the constitution of Italy, because we have now a very primary position regarding the other Orthodox confession. So and there is a principle of injustice about that.
Okay,
this will be worked for years.
We give a last question, and then you will have final comment, and then we will be dismissed for lunch. Now, isn't this a book that is about ecclesial ideologies and the need for them? That you suggest a new way of having an ideology, namely civil society instead of nation and emperors?
Probably this book that criticizes political orthodoxy suggests new political orthodoxy instead. As I said, I can be criticized for that. I admit that probably this criticism has some sense. But still, I justify this book by the idea that at least it's an updated kind of like a political orthodoxy. The second thing is that we have to distinguish. We need to name things by their names. We have to distinguish between orthodoxy proper and orthodoxy, even though they will conflate with one another forever. And they are inevitable that they stick to one another. We need to distinguish in this regard what happens to be the Christological concept of distinction, which goes back to Cyril of Alexandria, the theory of money, when we only in theory can distinguish some things like humanity and divinity in Jesus Christ. So we probably can distinguish between political orthodoxy and orthodoxy proper in the modern church phenomena. And we should make this distinction without hope that they will be ever separated. At the same time, I think thank you for mentioning this idea of ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is not just about theology. Ecclesiology is not just about the ideal side of the church. Ecclesiology is also about the real side of the church, including the human element, including all the complexity of humanity, ideologies, politics, social issues, social justice, life of people, people's identity, people's culture, everything that people do. Even what people eat, where they meet together, the language they speak, everything which is human needs, and therefore which belongs to the church, has to be discussed in the framework of ecclesiology. And probably ecclesiology is the most appropriate discipline to discuss, to study.
So let's do an ecclesiological act, eating lunch. Thank you.